Okay, let's begin. Inga mana, inga reo, inga karangatanga maha. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Rachel Tokoingoa. I'm the team leader of the transition team at the Ministry for the Environment, and I'll be facilitating today's session. Welcome to today's session on transport as part of the emissions reduction plan. Please be aware that this webinar is recorded and will be shared with participants who are unable to make it today. On the call today, we have officials from the Ministry of Transport who will be leading today's presentation. But before I get into introducing them, I'd like to begin with a karakia. And feel free to join in with me. Joe, if you could go to the next slide, please. It looks like we don't have the karakia. Okay, we'll skip the karakia today and go straight into the introduction and the presentation. So we acknowledge that many people are facing challenges at the moment, and we really appreciate the time you've set aside to join us. As you'll be aware, on 13th of October, we released a discussion document on the emissions reduction plan titled Te Hau Marohe Ke Anamata, Transitioning to a Low Emissions and Climate Resilient Future. Throughout the session, we'll refer to the emissions reduction plan as the ERP. We're running a series of presentations to provide information about the ERP and to give you an opportunity to ask questions. You can also make a submission on the ERP, and submissions are due on the 24th of November. A link to the discussion document was included in the invite to this webinar, and you can also find it on the Ministry for the Environment website. The format for this presentation will be a presentation of roughly 20 to 25 minutes, led by Joe Pohatu, who's a Principal Advisor at the Ministry of Transport. This will be followed by an opportunity to ask questions and for officials to respond with answers. And we've got Ewan Delaney and Mika Welvat on the call who are ready to take your questions. The Ministry for the Environment and the Ministry of Transport are working together with officials from the whole of government. If you'd like to make a question, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom. And we do ask you to keep these questions brief so we can get through as many as possible. This session is focused on transport, of course, so please keep your questions focused on the scope upper. We have upcoming webinars on other sectors, so if you have questions about those other sectors, please hold them for those sessions. And finally, I'll hold questions until after Joe has presented. And now I'll hand over to Joe to introduce herself and begin the presentation. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Joanna Pohatu ahau. As Rachel said, I am a Principal Advisor at the Ministry of Transport. And my task today is to introduce you to what we are doing for the first emissions reduction plan and give you some high-level information around what transport is actually doing towards that process. So here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we are already seeing the effects of climate change, and we've observed increases in national average temperatures, changes to rainfall patterns and rising sea levels. The recently released report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change highlighted the urgency with which we need to act to reduce emissions. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Climate Change Response Act provides the framework for responding to climate change. And through the Zero Carbon Amendment Act in 2019, it set two targets for us for 2050, to reduce long-lived greenhouse gas emissions to net zero and biogenic methane emissions to 24 to 47% below 2017 levels. A target to reduce emissions by 10% below 2017 levels by 2030 has been set for biogenic methane. To reach these targets, the Act sets out a system of emissions budgets and emissions reductions plans. Emissions budgets set a limit on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are allowed across a 5-year period, and the emissions reduction plan sets out the policies and the strategies that we as a country will need to achieve these budgets. The Zero Carbon Amendments also set a framework for climate change adaptation, and they require a national climate change risk assessment and a national adaptation plan to be produced every 6 years. The first risk assessment was published in August 2020, and the first adaptation plan, which will outline the actions the government will take to address identified risks, will be published in August 2022. To monitor and advise the government on its progress to reduce emissions and adapt to the risks and impacts of climate change, the Zero Carbon Act established the Climate Change Commission. And in May, many of you will have seen the Commission's first set of advice on transitioning Aotearoa New Zealand to a low emissions future and our first set of emissions budgets. The government must now respond to this advice and have its first set of emissions budgets and its very first emissions reduction plan in place by the 31st of May 2022. Working as partners under Te Tiriti o Waitangi is really important. The Climate Change Response Act recognises the government's responsibility to give effect to the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And making inclusive, impactful and sustainable change can be achieved if we work in partnership with Māori to including them in the development of national strategies to reduce emissions and mitigate impacts of the changes to our economy. And also for us to support Māori to lead their own low emissions transition and decide their own priorities and pathways for the transition. Making an equitable transition is also really important. Our economy and society will look very different in 2050, and the changes needed to reach our targets will affect some communities, regions, and households more than others. For example, for households, some emissions reductions policies could result in higher prices for essentials such as petrol and natural gas. And emissions-intensive businesses will need to transition to lower emissions practices or new business models. But the transition will also bring opportunities. New industries and job opportunities are likely to emerge in areas such as the circular economy and the bioeconomy. In May 2021, the Climate Change Commission gave the government its recommended first 3 emissions budgets and a demonstration pathway for how we could reach those budgets by 2050 and reach the net zero target. This is shown by the dark blue line in the graph on the screen. Final decisions on emissions budgets will be made once this consultation process is concluded. However, the government proposes to broadly accept the Commission's recommendations with some modifications, and that's represented by the orange bars on the graph. As depicted by the light blue line, under the government's current projections, we are not on track to meet the 3 proposed budgets to meet our 2050 budget targets. And we will need ambitious and new policies to meet the budgets that we need to meet. We have estimated the emissions reductions potential of several policy options across all of the sectors, which could be included in the emissions reduction plan. At the low end, proposed measures are estimated to reduce emissions by 2.6 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, while at the high end, they would reduce emissions by 5.6 megatons of carbon dioxide CO2 equivalent. This large range is due to the high levels of uncertainties about how fast emissions will reduce. It is difficult to quantify the reductions that will result from proposed policies. For example, those achieved through research and development that supports innovation. However, there is clearly a gap between the policies we can confidently measure and what will be required to meet the first emissions budget, as shown by the far right bar over here. The government can review and amend the emissions reduction plan during its lifetime and enhance or add policies to further close the gap and manage uncertainties. Some of this gap will also be closed by measuring emissions reductions more accurately over the lifetime of the plan. We all have a role to play in terms of reducing our emissions domestically. We know that there is still work to do to ensure we meet our budgets, and the ERP discussion document that was released last week and the proposed policies within it are intended to encourage a discussion about what could be included in the final plan. We want to hear your views so that we can make sure that they inform the conversations that are already underway across government. The government has an important role to play in providing leadership and getting the policy and regulatory settings right. But the low emissions transition will also need our communities, our businesses, our iwi and hapu, our households, investors, and many other people to get involved. And it's encouraging to see many groups that already are implementing low emissions projects. We will need ambitious new policies to achieve the proposed emissions budgets. And this means that every part of Aotearoa, every business, every community, every farm, every family, whose future will be shaped in some way in the decisions that we take within the plan. This is why it's so important to get it right, and why the final plan needs to reflect government's ambition as well as your own. There are a number of aligning systems and tools that are within the consultation paper that we'd like to hear your feedback on. To successfully reduce emissions, we need to transform all sectors of the economy so that our systems point towards the low emissions pathway we need. The emissions reduction plan will set out a number of cross-sector tools to help us get there. This includes government accountability and coordination. So responding to climate change requires a coordinated work program across central and local government and action from all New Zealanders. We are seeking feedback on how governments and agencies can be held accountable for meeting emissions budgets and how we can work together to encourage public action and behaviour change. For funding and financing, climate change requires a step change in how we approach financing. Our climate targets will require significant, sustained investment, and we're consulting on how both private and public finance can contribute to this. Emissions pricing through the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme allows businesses and consumers to make the most cost-effective choices for reducing their emissions. We're seeking your views on how the New Zealand ETS can further support gross emissions reductions and manage forestry. For planning, effective planning in cities and in our towns, as well as for infrastructure, can help support emissions reduction and adaptation to climate impacts across many sectors. We're seeking feedback on how to integrate climate change goals within the resource management reforms and urban development and infrastructure. For research, science and innovation, this system will help drive the transition to low emissions by delivering knowledge and cutting-edge innovation. We're seeking feedback on where and how to direct research, science and innovation efforts to shift or lower emissions. And then there's the circular and bioeconomy. We are consulting on how Aotearoa New Zealand moves to a circular economy with a thriving bioeconomy. A circular and bioeconomy are based on restorative, circular systems that make greater use of resources, including renewable biological resources such as for food, building products, and energy. So this session today is focusing on transport. So how are we going to transition the transport sector? It will be a very high level summary as the transport content in the consultation paper. There's quite a lot of it, but we're giving you a snapshot of what the key things are in the consultation paper, but I'd encourage you to look at that content, and please feel free to put in any questions you might have as we go through these things, these next slides. So many of you will know that transport is our second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's responsible for approximately 20% of our gross emissions, and within that 43% of these are domestic carbon dioxide emissions, CO2. In the Commission's advice, they recommended that transport reduce its emissions by 13% by 2030, and that by 2035, this is reduced by 41%, so compared to 2019. In our calculations, that's equivalent to a 6.7 megatonne reduction from the 2019 levels. So it's a big task ahead for all of us. The Ministry of Transport released Hikina Te Kohupara in May 2021 that set out opportunities to decarbonise the transport system. That paper and the submissions that we received on it, close to 700, have been used to inform the policies that we are proposing in the ERP consultation paper. And as you can see, the Climate Change Commission and their advice had 3 focus areas for transport, which were very much aligned with those that we set out in Hekina Te Kuhupara. And those 3 areas of focus are reducing our reliance on cars and supporting people to walk, cycle, and use public transport. So very much a mode shift focus. Rapidly adopting electric vehicles and low emission fuels, and beginning work now to reduce the emissions from our heavy transport and from the freight sector. In the consultation paper, we are proposing 4 new transport targets. So these will be of big interest, I'm sure, to many. The first target is reducing vehicle kilometres travelled by cars and light vehicles by 20% by 2035. This will primarily be, or particularly be, in the larger cities because that's where lots of the travel is being taken. The second target is increasing zero emissions vehicles to 30% of the light fleet by 2035. The third target is reducing emissions from the freight transport system by 25% by 2035. And our fourth target is reducing the emissions intensity of transport fuel by 15% by 2035. Achieving these targets will generate a 41% reduction in transport emissions by 2035, as suggested by the Commission. But we note that these do depend on complementary policies, such as a strong ETS, New Zealand ETS price, and changing the way we plan our towns and cities. And that many of these, the policies that might sit underneath these targets or contribute to these targets are interrelated and are complementary to each other. So I'm just going to give a high-level couple of slides on some of the policies that are in the content for the transport chapter in the consultation paper. Our first focus area, focus 1, is reducing the reliance on cars. So this is just a snapshot, it's not everything. And so I just want to emphasize that this is just to get the conversation going today. So in this area, we very much have a focus on our land use and our urban development and transport planning and investment side. So what are the things that we can do to have better connections between our urban planning and our transport planning? And how can we make it better for our communities? Improving the reach and frequency and the quality of our public transport. If we're moving people to be less in their cars, so reducing the vehicle kilometres travelled, we will need to ensure that we have the alternatives, such as better walking facilities or better public transport in place so that they can do so at a easier way. And it's really important to have that in place. We want to provide a national direction to deliver a step change in walking and cycling rates. There has been an increase in walking and cycling, but that needs to be significantly increased. And part of that work we want to do is look at what other things communities and councils might help to put that in place. Congestion pricing and enabling that primarily, initially maybe in the bigger cities, but then thinking about what we might do nationally will be something to help enable some of the change we might need in terms of behaviour, and we want to do work on putting in place measures along those lines, but also investigating what other pricing tools might contribute to reducing transport emissions alongside congestion pricing. And then the final dot point here is requiring further roadway expansion and new highways to be consistent with climate change targets, and that's just putting to the forefront of the thinking of the future roads that might get built, that actually they need to be considered with a climate lens so that we don't forget the tasks that we're actually trying to aim for in terms of reaching that net zero target. Just want to re-emphasise many of the policies, as we've said before, can be done in combination with lots of others. For example, your planning and your PT would go hand in hand alongside your walking and cycling, and they can all contribute collectively to the outcome we need. Focus 2 is our rapidly adopting electric vehicles. And this is looking at, we've already got the clean car discount and the clean car standard in place. And those things are working really well, but we want to also think about what are some of the community-based solutions we might need to enable low emission vehicles to be more accessible to low-income New Zealanders. And we also need to think about wanting New Zealand to not become a dumping ground for the high emitting internal combustion engines and vehicles that the rest of the world no longer wants. So many countries around the world have put in place a policy and a decision that they are banning these ICE vehicles. And so we're proposing that we follow suit in that so that we do not become the dumping ground, in part because the vehicles, when they get into New Zealand, they stay in our system for a very long time. So we want to indicate, and that will also help if we've got that policy in place, indicate to the market and the supply side in terms of those making the electric vehicles that we are serious about this. We're also providing a proposal to set a CO2 limit for individual ICE vehicles that are imports to have tackle the highest emitting vehicles, so to change that profile that we have. Down the bottom here is investigating the tax system. This is an example. Lots of people focus on fringe benefit tax as being one of the things we should look at, but we want to have a good thorough look at the tax system to consider are there any barriers in terms of the way the system works that is stopping us moving to a stronger and a less emissions intensive transport system. The third focus area for us is heavy transport and freight. The ministry released its green freight paper 2 years ago, and that's been picked up in some of the work we're carrying forward. And that focuses on what are the opportunities to change and improve the heavy transport sector. We're also developing a freight and supply chain strategy, so the work on that has commenced. It's really important to fully understand that sector and see where efficiencies might come in with a climate lens, not necessarily just the efficiencies from a business case lens. And we're working on introducing a sustainable biofuels mandate that's been agreed by government that we do that, and we're working on that at the moment to develop what that might look like. And alongside this, we've started working with both maritime and aviation sectors in terms of how and what we could do to reduce the emissions from those sectors, even though they don't make up a large portion of the emissions domestically, but they are still part of the story and they shouldn't be forgotten. So our transport policies, they will need to be done in partnership with Māori. And partnering with iwi Māori to co-design and develop solutions, it will be critical to reduce emissions and address existing transport inequalities. We will support iwi Māori to fully engage on this co-design. And for many people and communities, transport is not affordable or accessible. And there are major opportunities to make society more inclusive and equitable by transitioning to this zero carbon transport system. This will, however, require specific effort to ensure the transition is equitable. And we need to ensure that cleaner vehicles become more affordable over time and that we improve access for people that are already underserved by our current system. There are many benefits of the transition, and I covered some of these earlier in terms of the wider climate change benefits. But the emphasis here is it can improve the well-being of New Zealanders, and it will make transport more inclusive, make it safer. So if we put in cycle lanes where there's a bit of, and it's a stronger and more meaningful cycle lane, then we've got better outcomes in terms of safety. We've got improved health, so if more people are walking and cycling, we can change our health profile. And also if we've got less congestion, we've got improvements in terms of what's the types of vehicles on the roads, plus also the types of pollution that might be coming from those vehicles. And the other thing that we get from a benefit is that it supports economic activity in a strong way. So the last slide, high-level slide on the transport content is this one, which sets out what and how the targets look based on the 3 focus areas. And so the 4 new targets we propose span the 3 focus areas. So it's not just within one, they interrelate to each other. And so it's really clear that this is seen as a whole package, and it's not something that is just picking 1 or 2 policies to go forward with. Collectively, the transport policies are a package of things that we need to do and need to touch on across the whole transport system. Together, the targets and the policies that we've proposed here, if they work together, can achieve a 41% reduction in transport emissions below the 2019 levels by 2035, which is where we need to aim for. Changes to baseline emissions, which is the bottom green line down at on the chart, It includes the effects of growth in the vehicle fleet and electrification of the vehicle fleet under our business as usual scenario. And other changes, which is the line above, the very pale green line, includes the impact of the ETS price on electrification and travel. Focus areas 2 and 3, which we've talked about, that's your EV uptake and decarbonising heavy freight and transport. Both include the impact of alternative fuels, such as biofuels. So that's what our picture looks like in terms of what we need to be striving for and the ambition we need to have as a country. So just wrapping up this webinar before we get into the questions, and I can see there's quite a few that have come in. If you want to make a technical or short submission, you can do that through the consultation hub, which is found on the Ministry of the Environment website. And you can also email questions to the Air Climate Consultation 2021 email that's shown there on the screen. And if you are making a submission, which we strongly encourage you to do, you can post that in or email that through. Rachel touched on this at the very beginning. There are other webinars coming up, so you can see those here. Access to registering for those, which you already know because you registered for this one, is on the Ministry for Environment website. And so those are things if you have an interest to log into. And the final slide is just showing that this is a whole of government process and that there are many agencies that are involved in the development of the emissions reduction plan, and transport's just one of them. And so that's there. And I'm going to stop sharing and we will start our questions. Over to Rachel.
Kia ora, thanks, Jo. Thanks for the presentation. There are a lot of questions rolling in, so thanks very much for putting those up. Some of them have been answered already. So if you click on the Q&A function, you'll see in the answered box that that some have already been provided with written answers, but some of those I'll actually just go over again because I think they're probably relevant and worth kind of drilling into a bit further. So the first one is, are you able to share the inputs and assumptions behind the modelling which the 20% VKT cut, vehicle kilometres travelled, cut is based? And I'll hand that question to Mika.
Kia ora. Yes, we are able to share our assumptions behind that and the research that we base those assumptions on. We also can share to some extent the inputs that we used. Our model has a lot of interacting features, so we've had lots of requests for this before, so getting the exact slice that you may be after might not be possible, but we're happy to talk further about what area you're interested in and to see whether we can provide you the information that's helpful for you. Yeah.
Thanks, Mika. We've got a question that Ewan has answered in writing, but perhaps you can elaborate on this about congestion charging. Does the Ministry of Transport envisage congestion charging just in city centres or other parts of cities?
Thanks, Rachel. There's work underway on that. The intent is that we create a model that can be picked up and adapted to different local contexts. So the initial focus is on Auckland, and we're working with Auckland Council, but the idea is that the framework the approach that we take should be one that can be picked up and adapted to different geographies and different cities, different congestion problems, for example.
Thanks, Ewan. There's a question about a slide on the estimated impacts of policies. So the question is, what policies are those? The ones that are in the ERP or policies that have already been decided or implemented? Megan, you've made a comment that if we go back to that slide, you can respond to that question.
Yeah, sure. I don't have the slides with me, but if we think about Joe's graph with the focus group areas, I can talk about what goes into those. So that includes some of the current policies that are already in place, so the clean car discount and standard. And it also includes policies that we're proposing as part of the emissions reduction plan. And then on top of that, it also includes policies that we could do and that we are looking to develop as part of this process. So we'd probably have to do all of them in order to achieve particularly that 2035 goal.
Thanks, Vika. I've got a question from Robin, which I'll hand to Joe in a moment. When will you ban importation of ICE or internal combustion engine vehicles, including freight? What plans that won't increase greenhouse gas emissions do you have to provide power for electric vehicles?
Kia ora, thank you, Rachel. We haven't proposed a date. I think in the consultation paper, we think about putting in the ICE ban in 2030 or 2035. So we want to hear submitters' views on when that might be. So no date is locked in because it hasn't been agreed by government. So, but what we want to do, and there's a specific question in the consultation paper, is what is New Zealanders' appetite to an ICE ban, and are you keen to have an ICE ban in place? Because that itself has a bit of a political lens to it, and we want to understand people's need to do that. Our preference is to get it in as soon as possible because that does influence the policies that we go forward with, but we need buy-in to be able to influence to push that through. In terms of power for EVs, we are working on a EV infrastructure plan and roadmap with MfE, and that work is pushing through in terms of how and what might be required to ensure that sufficient infrastructure for EV charging is in place across the country, taking in consideration things like housing as well, and not just the things that you might need on the roads. So that work is underway as well to ensure that we have that, and working alongside MfE because they're important in terms of the power source as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. Another question on EVs. Can the EV target be achieved with the proposed EV policies in this plan, or would additional policies be needed, or the existing ones dialed up? From memory, this question's from Henry, the best case scenario modelling for the clean car policies had EV uptake much lower than this target.
So the clean car policies which are sort of in progress, the clean car standard and the clean car discount will help us get quite a long way there. I think the way I would characterise it is that the things that we have in the emissions reduction plan consultation document are a large proportion of the things that would need in place to get to that 30% EV fleet target. It's a fast-moving area in terms of the technology and the supply of vehicles, and so I think that's one we will need to keep under review over the next few years as the range of vehicles and the supply of vehicles changes in that time, and we may need to take some additional steps.
Thanks, Ewan. Question from Holly. How will these transport targets be embedded across transport policy and decision-making processes? For example, will they be explicitly adopted as criteria in CBAs or cost-benefit analysis and business cases for new projects, so that projects which do not contribute to these targets will not be able to proceed?
I'll jump in for that one, Rachel. So thank you, Holly. It's a very good question. At the moment, the targets are not proposed to be regulatory, so they are high-level targets that we want to lock in terms of the pathway for transport. And we will need, it's the policies and the things underneath it that will need to be embedded. But fundamental to it is, you're right, in terms of, and we have to think it through a little bit further in terms of the work that we need to do, is how will we underpin the future work in terms of cost benefit analysis or investment choices that we make, so that these targets are kept front of mind for the shape of the transport change that we're required. So there's a little bit of work required in terms of how we might implement this and what it might mean. In part, that's dependent on what are the packages of policies that underpin it as well, and how we can influence those as well. And once you put those together, then we can actually prescribe and consider how best to put that in place.
Thanks, Joe. And the next question from Phil is related to the previous one. What is the mechanism for requiring future highway building to be consistent with climate change targets? You may have already answered it.
Not quite. I think, so what we're thinking about there is that we may need something in the government policy statement on land transport for this one, and work is being undertaken with the team within the ministry on how we could give effect to this. Currently, lots of investment is done through the government policy statement and through the National Land Transport Fund. So we're looking at what other hooks we will require for that to ensure that this is a fundamental thing that is considered in those future investment decisions that are made.
Thanks, Jo. Got a question from Drew. When you mention initially in major cities, are you excluding other cities and towns from early funding to transition, or are you saying that emissions reduction targets will be for major cities first?
Sure, that was me saying that. What we're saying is for the VKT target, there'll be emphasis on the cities, but the VKT reduction that's required will be across the whole of New Zealand. But there are some cities like Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, etc., where this is more of a problem than your small rural areas. So greater emphasis on that. The transition is for the whole of New Zealand. It's not just for the major cities, but it's in some areas there's going to be greater emphasis and more effort required to make the change that's required. So thank you.
Thanks, Jo. Question from Peter. How can we stop continuing use of existing fossil vehicles in New Zealand? Do we just stop registering them after a certain date? Or do we increasingly jack up the registration fees for fossil fuel vehicles consistent with their emissions?
Could you repeat that? I'm not sure if that question is referring to the fleet already in the country or vehicles coming in.
Yeah, so I'll just repeat the whole question. How can we continue use of existing fossil vehicles in New Zealand? So do we, yeah, is that enough?
No, sorry.
Keep going. Do we stop registering them after a certain date, or do we increasingly jack up the registration fees for fossil vehicles consistent with their emissions?
Right. So I think this is asking about the fleet that's already in the country, not vehicles coming in. It's a good question. I think what I've just note there is we do have an old vehicle fleet in New Zealand. The average vehicle age is quite old compared to a lot of other developed countries. So one of the things that is in the ERP document is a proposal for a scrappage scheme to encourage the replacement of inefficient, unsafe vehicles. And so that's definitely a thing that we're going to be looking to do. We've already got some policies in place to try and to rapidly improve the emissions performance of the vehicles coming in, both new and used vehicles. So over time, and with the kind of natural cycling of the fleet, that's sort of where our modelling shows that we would sort of essentially replace the fleet over time with a clean fleet. I hope that answers the question.
That's good. We've got a comment from Alejandro. So any changes to transport emissions that rely on urban form and planning inputs also need to consider the expenditure in emissions linked to upgrading infrastructure on three waters and electricity generation and transmission. It's not just the roading infrastructure. I don't know if you want to provide any comments on that, but just a comment that's been considered as part of the energy and industry section of the ERP, and also of course the planning chapter. So we are thinking about the broader support that's needed for transport. Ewan or Jo, I don't know if you want to comment on that as well.
I think that would be the main thing I would say. It's one of those in complicated areas which sort of cuts across some of the investments that we need to make in infrastructures will have a short-term emissions consequence because of the way that we build things. Of course, the construction and energy sectors are also working to kind of drive emissions out of those activities as well over time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the comment, Alejandro. A question from Gabriella, which I'll hand to Jo. What does MOT propose to look at in terms of building equity into future transport policies and within the ERP?
Kia ora. It's a great question, Gabriella. In the consultation paper, we have a couple of areas where we're proposing things that can help with the equity issue. So we're looking at so the scrappage scheme in particular, and having that have a lens in terms of enabling lower household incomes to scrap their vehicle and get some sort of credit towards either a better quality vehicle or alternative mode of transport, such as an e-bike, etc. We're looking at social leasing and how can we put such schemes into place in the communities that need them. We have a pilot that will be starting, was due to start in this year in August, but because of COVID, it's been delayed. But there's a social leasing scheme starting up in Manukau early next year, and that's providing safer and cleaner vehicles to particular parts of the community, and that has improved outcomes in terms of both the climate transport side, but also economic for those whānau that are involved, which is a great thing. We're looking at other forms of social effort, so having conversations. We need to have a conversation with communities about what they might want, so adjusting fares, bus fares as well, that's part of what we're looking at. Can we bring those down for particular parts of our society, like those on community services card, or parts of our communities that would benefit greatly from that, and also all of the like different things like mobility as a service and things like that. So we're trying to build in a package. We may not have it right yet, but we're very conscious that in the transport world we need to consider more equity things to ensure that we bring everyone with us, because currently the system isn't fair, and it needs to have a better lens on that side of it, which is a big change for us.
Thanks, Jo, and yeah, great question, Gabriella. Thanks for that. Got another question for you, Jo. So transport regulation and road rules generally give priority to vehicles. Can the Ministry of Transport accelerate the accessible streets regulation change to make it easier for road controlling authorities to roll out change?
It's a great question, and very much a focus for us in terms of that focus area 1 in the emissions reduction plan consultation paper. So we're very keen to make some changes to make it easier for councils and communities to do more of this. We see that this is really important. It just does require behaviour change from everybody in terms of accepting that this is the way forward. So it's very front of mind in the design that we want to have for the ERP, and embed that for the future that we need. So yeah, definitely.
Great. We've got another question about equity of the policies. So do you consider the equitable transition regarding gender and ethnicity? So I think the question is, have we thought about gender and ethnicity in terms of the impacts of policies? What's the impact of your proposed policy on gender in our diverse community? That's a challenging question.
It's a great question. And I think more broadly, it's probably something we need to look into. I think we know that like on public transport, most of the people taking the public transport with their children are the mums and things like that. So there are some gender differences in terms of how people travel. So we will need to drill into that, I think, and it would be good if you could help, if you've got any ideas on what we might do on that. So thank you.
Okay, we've got a question about biofuels, the biofuels mandate. Can you provide more detail on the sustainable biofuels mandate? Who will do what and when?
I can provide a little bit more detail on that. So we did just complete a consultation on some proposed design features of the biofuel mandate, and now working, responding to that consultation on some final design options. So nothing has been agreed finally just yet, but the government will be likely making some decisions on the mandate in the next few months. The intent, at a high level, the intent is to impose a mandate on fuel suppliers. So the expectation will be that fuel suppliers will supply a certain proportion of biofuel into the fuel they bring into New Zealand from whenever the policy would start, which is, again, still yet to be determined, but could be 2023 or 2024. So yeah, can't provide that much more detail about exactly how it will work, because many decisions have been made yet. And we would need to legislate to introduce the mandate as well.
Thanks, Ewan. Question from Rod. Will a CO2 equivalent emissions limit on ICE vehicles prevent the use of carbon neutral fuels such as bioethanol? And I'll hand this question to Mika.
Hi, yeah, so the short answer to that is probably not. Ethanol and almost all biofuels are more expensive than their fossil fuel equivalent. So anything that's around reducing your emissions in the vehicle, it kind of works separately to that. Your biofuels changes all around what goes in. So I think broadly, it's unlikely.
Thanks, Mika. Another question for you from Gray. It's quite a long question, but I'll read it all out. Why is the proposed reduction in transport emissions by 2030 so small, 13%, compared to the 60 to 70% reduction needed to meet our 1.5 degree goal? Councils already have stronger targets, so we'll keep pushing out changes in infrastructure funding under this plan. We can't wait until the 2030s. This proposal won't even get us into the right ballpark by that time.
So
it's more of a
yeah,
comment.
all a fair thing to raise. The emissions reductions that we've put together for transport in the emissions reduction plan are aligned around the Climate Change Commission's demonstration path for transport. So that's effectively guided how far we go at each point in time. That being said, it's a lot of work to achieve those 2030 and 2035 goals that the Climate Change Commission has, and coming up with further ideas of how much further we could possibly reduce emissions in those spaces is quite challenging, particularly if we're looking at spaces that local councils are probably going to be involved in, like mode shift. We're already feeling a bit challenged about how big that mode shift goal is and what that means in terms of things that we have to do by those points in time, and how much of those things that we have to do. Yeah, hope that helps.
Thank you. A question from Henry. When might we expect regional or city VKT reduction targets? Will this be part of the final ERP or the updated mode shift plans?
That might be a me question. I would say that we probably won't be able to have that in the final ERP, things broken down by specific cities. We are honing in on where things are likely to land for particularly big spaces like Auckland, but there's still a lot of work to be done to work out what that is and build that. Our estimates for VKT reduction are largely top down, and to work out the city-based targets would probably have to be a more bottom-up approach, which will take a bit of time to put together, and we're working with Waka Kotahi on, so probably not.
Thanks, Vika. Question about behaviour change. The ERP paper refers to behaviour change. How will this happen? And does it include educating drivers through things like periodic emissions testing of vehicles on the road?
Thank you, Rachel. It's a good question. Behaviour change can come in many forms, and we haven't thought and prescribed how that might look and what that might be. But what we recognise, and there's further work happening for the broader ERP as well around behaviour change and what we might need to do collectively as a society, is to remove some of the people's appreciation that yes, we do need to do something in climate change to reduce our emissions, but then when it comes down to individuals, people not necessarily wanting to make the personal changes that are required. So there's a big pathway ahead for us. For transport, that might be putting the information out around what your vehicle profile might look like, and can you do other things like not driving your vehicle on particular days, or can you car share or do other things where you can actually reduce your footprint. So there's lots of things that could be thought about, but we haven't drilled into that for the consultation paper at this point. But it's around removing NIMBYism, I guess, is what the key thing is that we all have a role here, and that's where the emphasis is in terms of that behaviour change. Ewan, are you going to jump in here as well? Oh no, he's not.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add a little bit to that. So I mean, the suggestion in the question around that an opportunity, that I think that is an opportunity. It's a kind of opportunity we might need to think about, where people bringing their cars in for tests, and that might be an opportunity to kind of highlight, whether through information or through some additional kind of requirements, to say, well, there's an opportunity here to improve kind of emissions performance. An example of where we're doing that in a small way currently is with the proposed clean car standard and discount. We're proposing to have an update to labelling that will go on vehicles in showrooms and online, so that you can clearly see the emissions impact of vehicle choice. And so that's just a small example. There'll be lots of other opportunities to do that kind of thing.
Thanks, Ewan. We have quite a few questions rolling in, so apologies, we won't be able to get through all of them. So we'll just take probably 3 or 4 more so that we can finish before 1. So the next question is for you, Ewan. The ERP paper mentions using scrappage to help low-income families. How do you see this working?
So as I start by saying, there's still detailed work to do on what a scrappage scheme or policy might look like. At a high level, though, the way that it could help low-income families is, we know that a lot of low-income families spend quite a large proportion of their household income on fuel, and will typically be driving, on average, will be driving less efficient cars and less safe cars. So a scrappage scheme, by providing some kind of subsidy or incentive to help low-income families afford cleaner, safer cars or other sustainable transport options, we would expect that to, I think the intent is that we would design something that has that achieving that objective in mind. So potentially targeted towards parts of the population that are particularly facing those problems.
Thank you. Another question for you, Ewan. If other countries already have low emissions policies, and we will have a low and going lower emission standard for vehicles, how can we become a dumping ground for high emitting vehicles? Maybe that's how can we avoid becoming a dumping ground for high emitting vehicles? They won't exist overseas and we won't let them in. Why do you keep referring to this if this policy is already in place?
So the point of the policies that we're looking at is to try and prevent this happening. So policies like the clean car standard and clean car discount will help to mitigate this risk, or to prevent this risk coming into play. Other countries are introducing these requirements, and I think the view we have is that it's important that we keep up with that and keep in step with that. Otherwise, if our standards are lower, as other countries move away from higher emission vehicles, we will that supply that remains will be more likely to come to the New Zealand market, and we don't want that. So yeah, the things we're doing are trying and avoid that risk actually becoming a reality.
Thanks, Ewan. Got a question which Mark Story, who's on the call from Ministry for the Environment, he's the manager of the transition team at MfE. So I'll hand over to you in a second, Mark. Is there anything in place to ensure adequate or full implementation of the policies?
Kia ora koutou. Thanks for the introduction, Rachel. And yes, there will be. So the final ERP is basically what the Zero Carbon Act does. It sets up a process of emissions reduction plan, and then follow-up reporting implementation, and then a future emissions reduction plan. So when the final plan comes out, it will set out an accountability framework for the implementation of those actions. The actions will be, in some cases, more specific than what you see in the discussion document, and our intention is we'll be wanting to monitor and report progress against those, assign accountability, at least at central government level, for their implementation. And when some of the actions are quite hard to measure, we'll design key performance indicators so we can track progress for the implementation.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, I'll take 2 more questions. So this question is from Mike, and I'll hand this one back to Ewan. Is there any focus on diesel use in machinery or equipment that is not generally considered on road, so excavators, earth moving equipment, rollers, etc.? I suspect this presents a reasonable proportion of fuel use and an opportunity for both electrification and low emission fuel adoption.
Thanks. Good question, Mike. So there's a few things going on, I think, that will sort of get to this challenge, this particular question. I would note that, I mean, a large proportion of transport emissions are those kind of private road vehicles, like cars, vans, and utes, and then secondly, sort of freight emissions, and some of the equipment, machinery you describe, we wouldn't perhaps consider as being part of the transport system, but maybe will be captured by the construction sector ERP focused work. But biofuels presents a bit of an opportunity here in terms of reducing the CO2 emissions and potentially some of the other toxic emissions that workers working alongside those vehicles face. And so I think I would also highlight kind of, in addition to the CO2 opportunity there, and we are thinking about that kind of the local pollution, toxic emissions kind of angle as well. So for example, someone who's using an excavator or a drill in a kind of confined space. And so we are doing some work there to understand the scale of that problem and kind of the exposure that exists there and kind of the toxic emissions as well. So I guess, yeah, just to say, probably in terms of solutions, some of those will come from the construction sector. Biofuels will potentially help us a bit, and there's maybe an area where we would want to see a bit of biofuels use, and also just looking at other options not because of the CO2 challenge, but because of the other kind of local pollution challenge as well. Yes.
Thanks, Ewan. Final question from Tim. In the first budget period, you plan to deliver a strategy to boost cycling and a strategy to boost walking. How will work on each of these strategies start, and how can community groups participate in the development of these strategies?
Thank you, Tim. It's a great question. So we haven't started that work, but I'm sure once we actually get that underway, there'll be a public consultation process. But if you're interested in actually being involved in that, I'd suggest you email through on the consultation process and we can pick that up, because it will be something that will need to occur with local government, with our communities, in terms of what that might look like and how it shapes up. It can't be something that's just a central government plan. It needs to be done with the communities that will be affected with it, and given the support for what the change is that's required. So thank you.
Thanks, Jo. And yeah, thank you so much for all your questions. This is the most questions we've received from any webinar, so you get the prize for the most engaged audience, and they're really, really great questions. I'm conscious that we haven't been able to answer all of them. We've kind of got through just over half, so yeah, we'll have a chat internally about how to follow up on any important questions that you feel haven't yet been answered in the former part of the webinar. Cool. Yeah, conscious it's 1 minute to 1, so we'll just close off by thanking you very much for your attendance today and your questions and engagement in this kaupapa. And yeah, a reminder to make a submission before the 24th of November. The details are on the Ministry for the Environment website. Kia ora koutou, and yeah, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your days.